have begun recording. Welcome to our UC Master Gardener Coordinator Brown Bag webinar on inclusive volunteer selection. And this webinar today is going to kind of get the conversation started for our annual coordinator meeting that will take place on Monday, September 28th, virtually this year. And this year will be a promising practices exchange format. So unlike Volunteer Management Institute, wherein we hear from our partners outside of the UC system or within the UC system outside of UC A&R, and hear presentations from those individuals, we are going to be knowledge sharing within our community of UC Master Gardener coordinators and lead volunteers. As I mentioned, this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted to our Master Gardener Coordinator website and YouTube channel. I'm joined today by UC Master Gardener Program Director Missy Gable and Training Coordinator Lauren Snowden. Hi Missy, hi Lauren.
I guess I can unmute myself. Can you hear me? Like, that's good, right? I haven't plugged in my headphones yet. Maybe I'll do that.
Thanks, Lauren, and welcome, and Missy, welcome. I just want to begin, this wasn't on our agenda, but I want to thank those of you who are on the call today, and also just hold a little bit of space for those that aren't on the call today. We understand that there are a number of compounding disasters. I would include COVID-19 and the wildfires that are sweeping the state of California a little bit early this year. And so just want to appreciate those of you who are able to be here, and also hold some space for those who aren't able to join us today. And just know, if you're watching this, you can feel free to reach out to any member of the statewide team if you have follow-up questions, or if you want to connect on any of the content that we provide today. So thank you for joining us. We appreciate you being here, and thank you for making the time to connect with your fellow UC Master Gardener coordinators and lead volunteers. So welcome. We're going to talk about some meeting objectives and logistics for today here in just a moment. We are also going to dive right into our recommendations for inclusive volunteer selection, and I'll define that and provide a little bit of background here in just a moment. We'll have time for comments and discussion, and then we'll have some closing remarks and reminders. And then I will leave this meeting open, as we have been doing, for anyone that wants to stay on and connect informally with other coordinators, knowing that on Monday, September 28th, you're going to have a whole day of peer sharing around a variety of different topics. So today's objectives are threefold. We're going to address the current state of UC Master Gardener programs with regard to DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sorry, I defined that in the next bullet point. We're going to share some recommendations for centering or putting diversity, equity, and inclusion at the center of the volunteer selection process. And we're going to do a little bit of logistical conversation to prepare for our annual coordinator meeting, Promising Practices Exchange, where the keynote, the kind of the big talk that will happen in the morning, hopefully from an academic advisor within UC A&R, we're still waiting on confirming her, will give us a talk on steps that she's taken to ensure or move the program in the direction of equity. And one of the things that she's focused on is how she selects volunteers. To give a little bit of background, back in November of 2019, I was invited to present at the UC A&R County Director meeting by Area Environmental Horticulture Advisor and County Co-Director for Cooperative Extension in San Bernardino, Janet Harton, after she witnessed bias, and bias in this case on the basis of race, we would say, showing up in the volunteer selection process. And I created this presentation that I'll share with you today for that meeting. It's been adapted in some ways, but it essentially includes the same content. I want to acknowledge that while I continue to build my own knowledge and understanding of topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's the frame that I apply to volunteer engagement, I'm always learning about different and better ways of speaking about and building capacity to address systemic racism and inequity. So I'm not an expert. I'm really excited actually to present to this group, because it is this group that is like really grounded in knowledge and information about what program delivery in the UC Master Gardener program really looks like on the ground. I'll admit that some county directors at this meeting that I provided a talk to were saying, do we do we have an application process for the UC Master Gardener program? So you all really have that experiential knowledge, and you're going to be able to figure out ways to intervene, or you're going to be able to share with us and with your fellow coordinators interventions that you've already implemented in your counties that you hope are going to reduce bias in the process and ensure that our UC Master Gardener program is open to all who want or need to participate. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to share some ways that we can add to, amend, and extend the recommendations that I'm going to provide. And really, we're going to be doing that in a working session at our Promising Practices Exchange, as I mentioned. So today, I'm going to share two things that experts in volunteer engagement and in engaging diverse talent say to start doing in order to reduce bias in the process, the selection process, two things to stop doing, and two things to continue doing to advance the work of equity, particularly looking at selection processes. I want to prepare you by saying that our organization has a lot of work to do to become a fully multicultural and equitable organization. And so today and in our program, we're going to try to address this in some small way, but this work is going to be ongoing, and it's not something that is going to be complete after we participate in this webinar or in the Promising Practices Exchange. But I hope I'm going to share some resources within the UC system that can help guide us in this process. A few more logistical pieces. The 2020 annual coordinator meeting, which you've heard me reference several times, is our triennial Promising Practices Exchange. It usually takes place in person the day before our in-person conference. And as you know, all of our activities have moved virtual for this year. So our Promising Practices Exchange meeting will be online. I encourage you to navigate to the Promising Practices Exchange page on the UC Master Gardener Coordinator website and register. Registrations are going to be accepted up through the 14th. And really, normally when we register, we're saying, you know, these are my dietary restrictions, or this is when I'm going to arrive. The thing that I'm hoping to understand is really to get a head count and to understand what kinds of breakout sessions you're interested in, and also to understand how many folks we have so that I can build those breakout sessions appropriately. So please do register. And I believe Lauren's just dropped a link in the chat for me. So thank you, Lauren, for doing that.
Welcome.
Throughout this presentation, you're going to see two icons, or a few different icons. You're going to see this sign, which is going to indicate that whatever we're discussing on that slide is a recommendation that to start, stop, or continue, and whichever color is going to be like kind of glowing or have a starburst in it. So it'll be a good visual reminder, oh, we're talking about some things to stop doing or to continue doing. You're also going to see this icon, which is an indication that there is an online or print tool available to you. And some of those are going to be in the chat box perhaps today, or they're going to be posted to the Promising Practices Exchange page that we referenced earlier and available to you after this presentation. So those are the two icons to kind of clue you in on what that slide content is really pointing to. At this point, many of you are very familiar with this image. This is the opening image for our Building Volunteer Engagement e-course. If you've not yet completed this course, and some folks on this call have recently joined us, so don't stress, you're going to hear from me about how to access this course. It's a 45-minute self-guided course that will help you build a volunteer engagement plan. But why I'm introducing it today is it introduces a framework for thinking about volunteer engagement that I find really useful, and it's the ISATURE model. So ISATURE is an acronym. It stands for identification, selection, orientation, training, utilization, recognition, and evaluation. So really, it's thinking about the entire volunteer life cycle. When a volunteer is engaged with our programs, they're first identified, and throughout those processes of being engaged in our programs, they're hopefully recognized and evaluated. And we don't necessarily evaluate our volunteers by saying like you're doing, say, a swim test at the pool. You're not getting a pass or a fail, but we're hoping that we're engaged in conversations with our volunteers to ensure that they are successful in their volunteer role. And I realize I do want to acknowledge that we're talking about selection. Some folks may be thinking, we don't have a selection process. We accept every volunteer or prospective volunteer that walks through our door. That is great. However, I will say that our research indicates that having some sort of selection process, and it's not a cookie cutter one size fits all situation, is an important step in ensuring volunteer satisfaction and retention. They kind of go hand in hand, but what we're really interested in is the volunteer satisfaction piece. So the reason behind this is that these interview processes or application processes, and I know most people fill out an application. It's not just like a text that says, I want to be a Master Gardener volunteer, but the interview processes really allow volunteers or prospective volunteers to learn about the culture of the organization. And also it supports the organization in understanding what are those volunteers' unique skills and abilities that may serve the organization. And this is going to improve the likelihood that a volunteer is appropriately supported or placed, and then it's going to strengthen that retention and satisfaction figure. I also want to note that the reason that I want to focus on selection is if an organization cannot become the kind of organization that can successfully engage and satisfy volunteers from diverse backgrounds who are already interested in our programs, we're unlikely to be successful in future outreach efforts. And as I mentioned, the request for this presentation grew out of a real life situation in which there was bias that was showing up in the volunteer selection process. So we really want to be responsive to that situation, and also understand that this is a systemic issue. It's not about just one situation. And we'll look at that in just a moment when we look at our nationwide demographics of Master Gardener volunteers. So I think that we have an opportunity to inform our selection processes here, and also that might change the way that we ultimately do outreach. So oddly, before we can talk about what positive volunteer selection looks like, it might be helpful to think about deterrence to prospective or potential UC Master Gardener volunteers. So I have this list here. This is just based off of my informal survey of coordinators and volunteers that I've spoken to in this process, and also references to the literature. So I want you to, and I know it can be challenging, like let's start off on a negative note, but I want you to look at this list and drop into the chat 1, 2, 3 of these points that feel most salient to you. Like, what do you hear most from folks that say, oh, I'd love to be a UC Master Gardener volunteer, but, so go ahead and throw that in the chat. What do you think gets in the way of folks engaging with the UC Master Gardener program? Or maybe it's not something that you hear, but something that you know from prior experience or from your own research, or the lens that you apply to looking at volunteer selection. Okay, we're seeing a few comments. We're seeing a few comments that talk about, yeah, like time, work commitments, family commitments, class scheduling conflicts. Lauren brings up the perception that this program is only for those that already have a high level of horticultural knowledge, or like an ability to speak or pronounce Latin names of plants. Lots of work stuff coming up. I do see language coming up. Maggie, thanks for bringing that. Yes, sometimes a language barrier. We do deliver the majority of our content in English, so that can dissuade or prevent folks from engaging that might speak another language commonly spoken in California. So we might be thinking Spanish, Mandarin. Transportation is something that Catherine brings up. Thanks. Yes, we definitely see transportation issues, especially in counties that are really geographically disparate, or in spaces where we have some limitations as to where we can offer our UC Master Gardener training. So that's helpful. Costs not being listed. Yeah, so maybe sometimes not having enough information to make an informed decision about whether or not we want to join the program. Cool. Thanks for that. Is there anything else that isn't listed on this list? If folks want to drop them in. Let's see. Denise, nice. Prior exposure to Master Gardener volunteers. Yeah, we know that our program recruitment through word of mouth is really strong. And I also think that kind of gets to the volunteer culture piece. So organizations are made up of people and are sort of designed around the needs and interests of the members of the organization. This is one organizational theory, right? So who are our current master gardeners, and therefore our current UC master gardeners. We don't have statewide data for UC master gardeners, but these are the national demographics. On a national level, most master gardeners and master fruit preservers tend to be over the age of 40, female identified, college educated, more affluent than the average person living in the United States, and employed outside the home or retired from employment outside of the home. So we also know, based on very recent survey data, but also trends over time, and just the understanding of how measurements of those interested in gardening have been collected over a long period of time. This is not the only demographic interested in home horticulture, food gardening, climate smart landscapes, water-wise landscapes, community gardening, working with juveniles in detention centers, supporting pollinator habitat, connecting with food or food waste, stewarding land and water, right? So we know that our master gardener national demographics and what we tend to know about the UC master gardener demographic information, this is not reflective of the population of folks interested in gardening, and also the population of the states that and communities that UC master gardeners work in our case. So the demographics of our organization can send a powerful message about who the UC Master Gardener program is for, and this can lead to some critical competency gaps. Throughout the rest of the presentation, you're going to hear me refer to traditional volunteers, and this is just going to be my shorthand for that white, female-identified, college-educated volunteer over the age of 40. This is the historic UC Master Gardener volunteer demographic. However, we know that volunteerism is much more diverse. If you attended our VMI last year, you know that historically volunteer engagement statistics have failed to capture activism or faith-based volunteering. And you know that Gen Xers have the highest rate of volunteerism, and that our little ones, our Gen Zers, are actually the most engaged around climate issues. So we know that there's a lot of potential to grow our programs and to grow our impact if we can shift in large and small ways. And as I said, some of those structural barriers that we mentioned in the last slide are not things that we're going to be able to tackle in this presentation or at this level. It's going to require a sustained effort over time. So I acknowledge that, and I know that there are some changes that we really want to see in terms of structures in our program, and I think that desire to see those big changes shouldn't necessarily prevent us from taking meaningful action now. So that's my 2 cents. So as I mentioned, we're going to launch into a few starts, a few stops, a few continues. So what you're looking at right now is the first recommendation when it comes to starting something. And I also acknowledge that some folks are already engaged in this work, so I want to hear about that in just a moment. But we want to start providing educational tools and resources to volunteers tasked with organizing the selection process. For some people, you're like, hey, we don't have a selection process, so we might be starting from the ground up and providing educational tools and resources with volunteers who might be tasked with developing that selection process. Or if you're in a really small community and your community of master gardeners is 25 people, maybe this goes to everyone. So the first step is going to be to provide some implicit bias training for volunteers involved in the selection process. And this is not an end-all, be-all by any means, but the science is clear that labor market discrimination against people of color is real and appreciable, and that in-group bias can prevent hiring teams and or search committees from making fair and equitable decisions about job candidates. And that does extend to the nonprofit sector and volunteer realm. Volunteer selection committees and veteran volunteers make decisions all the time on behalf of the university, and they're not always applying to state and federal guidelines regarding affirmative action and inclusion. So the University of California just voted to reinstate affirmative action. And we have an affirmative action coordinator at UCANR who can speak much more specifically to what that means, but this is a value of the University of California. If you've heard your volunteers talk about who's the best fit or select outreach locations based on their assumptions about who makes a good volunteer, then this is a critical intervention, but it's just a start. Unconscious bias training has to be ongoing and long-term to be effective. And you may be thinking, that's great, but I don't feel equipped to provide that training. Well, you don't have to. And if you recall, back in the fall, I published, oh, did I just click on that? Okay, sorry, I'm gonna stop my share for a second and regroup.
Hi everyone, this is Lauren. I just dropped 2 things into the chat, which I think is what Marissa was going to talk about next. If you wanted to snag those and like stave them away somewhere. One is the UCLA Implicit Bias video series, and I believe that one's open to everyone, like it's not locked behind a wall or anything. And the next one is the UC Master Gardener program blog on implicit bias courses. So if you wanted to share that, you could share that link to your group as well if you have people who are interviewing or helping out with your selection process.
Thanks, Lauren.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, folks. So I'm not wanting to play this right now, but it appears to really want us to do that. So let me see if I can start on the next slide.
Has anyone taken the UCLA Implicit Bias video series training? I see head shaking of a no variety.
It's a really great tool. It was developed by the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UCLA. That's the term for their office. And the videos are 3 to 5 minutes long. I really think that this is a doable intervention, especially in the Zoom age, because at the top of, say, a committee or a council meeting, one of these videos could be played, and by halfway through the year, if you're playing them at monthly meetings, all participants of that committee could have viewed these videos, and they're really visually stimulating. They're really well done. The first one on biases and heuristics, which was a term that I wasn't totally familiar with, was really helpful to me in like understanding and framing the other videos. So I definitely recommend watching them in order. Apologies for the technical difficulties there. The next step beyond providing the implicit bias training to volunteers engaged in the selection process and really thinking about questions, candidate evaluation processes, panel makeup, just as a for instance, the next step might be to grow that to the leadership team, to the outreach team, and maybe eventually to all volunteers. I see the implicit bias trainings as a great opportunity for continuing education hours. Taken together, the 2 that were featured in the blog post that I published during the early part of this year, they'd make up about 3 hours of continuing education. So the robust Managing Implicit Bias course offered through UCOP is a 2.5 hour long course. So it really is very thorough, and it really is created for the UC specific audience as well. So I want to check the chat really quick to make sure that there's not something that I'm missing here. Great. Okay. Yes, there were a few folks who were able to view those. Awesome. Moving on, we have our recommendations to stop. Like, what should we stop doing? And the recommendation from volunteer engagement and recruitment professionals is to stop using interview and selection processes that don't align with university best practices. So it's like, okay, how do we do that? So think about your volunteer selection process. Do you know what it is for one, or do you have one? Can you be sure of the program's criteria? Are they the same for each person? Are they reasonable? Then think about who's doing the interview. If you have interviews in your county, is it one person? Is it a panel? Is it possible within your organization to create a panel that is diverse in terms of race, gender, ethnicity? What would that look like? Is that a possibility? So there are a few tools that might be, if you're thinking like, I'm not sure, what tools can I use? I want to highlight 3 that come from various UC sources. And the first is a checklist that's featured on the Berkeley Lab IDEA website. And it It has a number of different kind of questions and prompts for thinking about unconscious bias in job descriptions and advertisements. And while we don't have job descriptions for all of our volunteers necessarily, some programs do have job descriptions for their volunteers, and that's actually really great. It's really nice to get specific about what a position might look like, or a leadership position might look like in the volunteer-based program. I find this to be really helpful in helping us think about how we describe the volunteer role on our websites or in any literature that we create. And I really appreciate this checklist, which is thinking about bias in terms of gender, but there are other tools out there, and we'll talk about them in a moment, that think about race and ethnicity. So I want to pull out a couple of these checkpoints. So a question that this NCWIT, National Center for Women and Information Technology, thinks about is, are all the criteria listed necessary for doing the job well? And I love this question because I think that it's interesting to think about our volunteer-based program, and while we might say, tell me about your gardening experience, what we really want is folks who are educators, who are committed to community change and community impact. So I wonder if down in the chat, if you want to just drop in, if you had to identify a criteria that you think is really important for becoming a successful UC Master Gardener volunteer that isn't something that's always featured highly when we describe that role. So go ahead and drop that in if you have a moment or something kind of comes to mind. What is a quality or a criteria that's not listed, that might actually speak to an important competency of a UC Master Gardener volunteer?
Marissa, for some reason, that's a really hard question for me.
Cool. I like Dawn's contribution from her predecessor, Emma Connery. We can put the gardener in the volunteer, but not the volunteer in the gardener. Yeah, so that's interesting. So really thinking about we can grow someone into a gardener, right? We know that we have the skill and ability to do that, but that heart for community connection, volunteerism, that's an interesting one. Creative thinking and flexibility, that's cool. Maggie says, I do think it's usually featured, but not always. Do you understand the volunteer requirements to become a volunteer and maintain MG status? Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Lauren says, likes to share information and connect people with knowledge. Awesome. Let's try one more. Could additional criteria, so we're starting to get at that. What's that additional criteria that would open up possibilities to a wider range of candidates? So this is included on a lot of applications, but what do we think about language or an ability to guide an organization through a change process? Are there other criteria that we could get that would decenter the gardening piece? Because we know that we'll be able to provide folks with gardening knowledge, but really could bring to our organization new skills and knowledge. Moving on, I want to point out this other tool that comes from UC Davis Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office. It is, and I know you're not meant to be able to read these very small screenshots, but I want to give you a sense of what it looks like as an overview visual, and then those links are being thrown into the chat by Lauren. Thank you. This is a list of common but unfair evaluation tendencies, and I'll call out a couple of them here. The similar to me tendency. This is a tendency to treat candidates more favorably if they're perceived as being similar to the evaluator. And I want to say that these are, again, these are specific examples of unconscious bias showing up in the process. So it is the case that we do tend to evaluate folks more highly if they are similar to us. And this point is not being really specific about what that looks like, but I'm sure we can imagine, like, okay, are there some demographic characteristics, or is there a way this person presents themselves that is resonant with me? So that's something we have to be on guard against. Another one is stereotyping. So the tendency to judge a candidate by group membership, such as race, sex, age, disability, or another preconceived opinion. And again, doing these things doesn't make a person a bad person, right? These are common but unfair evaluation tendencies. They're things that we all do. So the question is not like, how can we deny that this is the case, but really how can we embrace that? Yeah, this is a reality. We all tend to utilize common but unfair tendencies. And when we're doing that as at an organizational level, this is something that we really want to work hard to figure out how to undo. And I don't have all the answers for that, but I want to share these ideas and suggestions with you that are being used in identifying and hiring and retaining diverse talent. One more, inferences about motivation. So assuming that we can know something about a person's motivation by inference from his, her, or their life circumstances. So I definitely hear this from Master Gardener volunteers that I speak with who talk about why we don't have younger people in the organization, or why younger people don't remain within the organization. Oh, that person is if you've ever heard someone say, that person's a new mom, that person's a working person, right? These are inferences that therefore this person won't be able to be a good volunteer or a quality volunteer by whatever standard that volunteer that's making that comment is applying. Common but unfair evaluation tendencies. And there is some evidence that bringing attention to this can help us at least develop language to talk about these issues if they do come up, and address them in ways that we'll talk about here in just a moment. The last piece that I want to mention is a list from, again, the UC Davis Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office that has some suggested questions to add to your application or interview process. And these are potential diversity interview questions. That's a big catch-all term, diversity questions, but basically these questions kind of reference that earlier sheet that was talking about what additional criteria are there, or what makes a good volunteer but that isn't currently represented in the interview or application questions. These questions include, how would your vision for this position, and you could substitute volunteer role, be aligned with the university's commitment to equity and diversity? So maybe even having the statement or a link to the principles of community or a statement on diversity on the application process or on the application page, really emphasizing this is a part of our vision and mission as a university. The next one, the university has a diverse workforce in terms of ethnicity, socioeconomic status, language, gender identity, sexual orientation, veteran status, faith, non-faith, disability status, and much more. Can you tell us about your experience working with and serving such a diverse population? So again, here what we're talking about is an ability to communicate across difference, and that is a really important tool that a UC Master Gardener has to have or be willing to develop, right? Okay, so our next step, we talked about editing materials, interview and selection materials with an eye toward inclusion. The next step, I think, going beyond looking at these discrete physical objects, which is like a list of questions, is to expand our view. Okay, how does our program website talk about criteria or imply criteria for becoming a UC Master Gardener? Do we have internal documents like volunteer position descriptions or county program bylaws that also make similar inferences? So these are some additional suggestions about expanding that application of these suggestions and ideas, and applying that equity rigor to those documents or those descriptions of the volunteer experience. Okay, what are you going to continue doing? Everything that you're doing. I'm inspired to talk with all of you about this topic because not only of the conversation that we had during our racial equity in the garden brown bag, but also because based on exchanges with you via email or conversations, I know that equity and improving the diversity and inclusiveness of our programs is a priority for so many of our coordinators, and that feels really inspiring. So another thing that we hope to do is continue to apply that lens and to continue to evaluate our county processes, projects, and initiatives against the mission of our volunteer programs. And I know that this is happening already, and so I encourage everyone to continue doing that and to share those successes. So the first step would be to revisit formal and informal practices that privilege prospective volunteers who share demographic characteristics with traditional volunteers. So what does this mean? This means that there may be some rules at the county level that prevent new volunteers who may tend to be, if we're doing our outreach right, our new volunteers may tend to be more diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, age, status as a working person than our traditional volunteers. And we talked about those demographics a little bit earlier on. So do we have practices that privilege prospective volunteers that share those demographic characteristics? Do we have an idea that a master gardener who interviews and doesn't match those demographic characteristics is not a good fit, right? So are there formal and informal practices? Are we just doing recruitment by word of mouth? Are we reaching out to our own networks instead of saying, what are the communities that are traditionally underinvested by the University of California, and how can we grow our programs and demonstrate solidarity with community-based organizations that are serving those that the University of California has underinvested in, right? So that's one place that I wanted to call attention to. And then the next step is to revisit formal and informal practices that privilege legacy volunteers. So are there rules about program leadership, or the number of years that a person has to have in order to become a project leader? So really thinking about, does a new volunteer coming into the program, do they have an opportunity and agency to make fundamental change within the organization? If we know that we want to grow our organization in terms of its ability to reach folks that are as diverse as all of California is diverse, we have to empower our volunteers who are new to the program, who can bring that energy and change and community connection, while also still honoring the contributions of our traditional volunteers. So really thinking about how to empower those new volunteers who are moving into our program and who are going to bring with them some new ideas and suggestions and ways to shift and grow our program in 2020. So with that, I'll share a few extra steps. So we talked about things to start doing, stop doing, and continue doing. If you're interested in any of it, and again, you're going to receive a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, but I really encourage folks to take the implicit bias courses if you're able to, especially that UCLA implicit bias video series. Again, all of them are less than 30 minutes. If you take the UCOP managing implicit bias training, you can do it through your LMS system. So you'll actually get a certificate for having completed that. So you may want to do that in coordination with your supervisor and get some credit for completing that course. Visit our racial equity tools on the UC Master Gardener Coordinator site, which are also going to include a link to some glossary and sources on the UC Davis Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion website. Recommit to strengthening your Master Gardener program evaluation effort. This will, pardon. This is part of our process of de-emphasizing the volunteer retention rate as a measure of the success of the program. So if we're really looking at program evaluation and community impact, then we have an opportunity to keep the conversation focused on program growth and impact. And then identify and promote locally accessible volunteer continuing education hours that relate specifically to building capacity in DEI. And I've provided some of these in some CT posts that are online opportunities, and they're also on the Racial Equity Resources page. But really think about maybe making 2020 a year in which continuing education is all about community engagement, is all about the equity lens, is all about really building vocabulary to think about inclusion, is all about restructuring projects so that we're targeting our programs at those that are underinvested by the University of California, and growing our cultural competency so that when folks encounter our program, they do it in a way that affirms their identity and place and their knowledge as a gardener. So these are a few suggestions and ideas for extra steps. And I think probably many of you have some extra steps that you could share with the rest of the group. And I hope we'll have a chance to do that here in just a minute. Before I do, I have a captive audience. So I want to say, register for the UC Master Gardener Program Coordinator Annual Meeting Promising Practices Exchange. The registration survey closes on September 14th. I'm going to show you in just a moment where you are going to drop your interest forms, applications, interviews, volunteer position descriptions, your selection materials in Box, in a shared folder in Box. And you may be like, what are you talking about? So the next step for this project, we've just had a conversation about re-interrogating our application materials and our volunteer selection materials with an eye toward equity, we're going to have a working session to do that together at the Promising Practices Exchange so that we can share ideas and suggestions. And we're going to look at 4 different examples of great applications and so-so applications and needs work applications from throughout the nation. And we'll draw on those best practices and those ideas that are both coming internally from the UC Master Gardener coordinator community and from our national community. So I invite you to drop your application and volunteer selection materials into a box that has your county name in a folder that's going to be shared with you in just a second, and I'll navigate to that so that you can see what that looks like. You will have an opportunity to review some volunteer selection resources, which are going to be on box and on the UC Master Gardener Coordinator website. And I'll show you that in just a second. And get excited about the opportunity to work together during the Promising Practices Exchange work session, which we'll take a look at and make recommendations about our applications, about maybe some interview questions. Maybe we look at including some of those diversity questions into our interview, or changing the language so that we're not being gender specific when we're describing certain tasks that a Master Gardener might take on, or looking at our position description and looking at how do we center gardening over some of the other skills that are really necessary to make a successful volunteer and a satisfied volunteer. So those things I'm going to show you in just a moment. And a couple of other reminders. We have so many, I have Big Dig Day, sorry, here instead of Brown Bag Webinar. We have many Brown Bag webinars coming up, not Big Dig Day webinars. But isn't every Brown Bag webinar really just like a Big Dig Day webinar in our hearts? So September 10th, we have September 10th. Something is really weird here with our dates. I'm sorry about this, folks. We have a Brown Bag webinar on the 14th. Of September, which is our COVID-19 and volunteer survey results. And then on the 28th, we have a Master Gardener Coordinator meeting, Promising Practices Exchange. Someone is helping me in the chat. Okay, events. Yes, thank you, Lauren. All of our events are available on the UC Master Gardener Coordinator website events tab. If you nominated a gardener with heart for Gardeners with Heart recognition, look out for an email from me or from our team, because we're hoping to do a little special thing during some of our virtual training events that are coming up. So heads up about that. And then I wanted to do one more reminder. This has been a traumatic time with COVID-19 and now with the ongoing wildfires in California. So I want to make sure that you all know that UC contracts with UC Davis's ASAP services to provide support for academic and staff mental health. There's an ASAP website. Again, you're not going to be able to click on this live link here, but you will have a copy of this presentation when it's uploaded to the Brown Bag webinar page of the coordinator site, and you'll be able to click on that live, or you can Google it. From a personal experience, back when I was working at UC Davis, there was a sudden death of a young person, of a student, and I found the ASAP resources very, very helpful for our community and understanding how to support our students and to provide support for the family. So I really strongly recommend utilizing their services in the event that, perhaps your UC Master Gardener community has experienced a loss, or you've experienced a loss. They're a really, really great team and are available for remote sessions to chat with you or chat with a group of folks who might be looking to support your volunteers through a difficult time. So that resource is available. Thank you, Lauren, for dropping that into the chat. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to just show you quickly where you can find our box online. So linked on the Master Gardener website, you will find a link to this box. So this is the UC Master Gardener Promising Practices Exchange website. Are you seeing this? Lauren, give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Okay, awesome. And you will be able to find a link to our shared box folder. It's going to redirect you. I don't know about you all, but box has not always been my friend. So I'm learning a lot about that. If for some reason you're unable to open the box, I would say a couple of different things. Be sure that you are logging in with your @UC Davis credentials, not your @UC A&R, and you're able to find a link to box through your A&R portal, but it's going to bring you to this special folder for the 2020 Youth Master Gardener Coordinator meeting. And here's where you're going to drop your volunteer selection materials. This is not so that your selection materials are analyzed by anyone at the statewide office. This is just for easy reference for all of you when we do our work sessions and look at Frankenstein the best possible application that is in line with inclusive volunteer selection best practices. So you would click on your folder and you can drag and drop or upload items into that folder. I'm pretending I'm Karina here and we just clicked on Butte. You're also going to find a couple of other folders. One of them is sample nationwide Master Gardener applications, and I'm going to throw a few more in here just so you can see how other people are describing their program. And we'll talk about what's working here and maybe what's not working here when we meet together. And then you're also going to see a folder for inclusive volunteer selection resources. There's nothing in here right now because they're going to be linked on the Promising Practices Exchange website, but I'll also go ahead and throw them in there. So I just want to drive you to this so that you see where you're going to ultimately put those volunteer selection materials for easy access by you and your breakout session during the Promising Practices Exchange. With that, we have 15 minutes remaining. So if anyone has any questions or ideas to share, let's try it this way. Let's have folks raise their hands. And the way that you're going to do this is you click on participants down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you should see a button that says like stop video and share screen, and you'll see participants. So if anything came up for you when we were talking about inclusive volunteer selection, or you have a question about like, how does this apply to me? Go ahead and raise your hand. You could also maybe be thinking, I have an idea that I really want to make sure that I share with folks about something that we've tried or that we've done. You can go ahead and raise your hand, and that'll help me understand how many people want to share so I can budget our time. You can also feel free to use the chat as well. Awesome. Let's go to Maggie.
So I'm one of the counties that doesn't get, we get a decent, we get like 50 to 60 applicants. So we do accept everybody for so far. But when I was listening to you, I was sort of wondering, like with an interview process is slightly different than a selection process, right? And so if we have the intention of accepting everybody most likely, then I could still see the value of an interview process. But could you sort of speak, do you know what I'm saying? Could you sort of speak to the difference, because the selection process sort of implies you will reject applicants, and an interview process is sort of like the onboarding process, right? And so I see them as being like slightly different. Can you speak to those? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you, Maggie, for that. And I think you're right. I think that if we think about the Isature model, what you're talking about is like the intersection between S and O. So we have like the S for selection and the O for orientation. But really in a program that's going to select everyone, your selection and orientation sort of collapse into one process. So I completely understand what you're saying there. I would say some volunteer engagement, and this does require, it requires a lot of labor on the part of the coordinator or on the part of like a team of volunteers. You might think of selection as selecting a volunteer for a specific role. So the volunteer organizations that have a ton of staff and really a lot of momentum might change their volunteer description every single year. They revisit that application every single year and say, you know what's missing? Folks who have computer skills, folks who have social media savvy, folks who have language skills, and they're changing and reframing their application every single year. So in that way, you would be selecting a volunteer for a specific role, or for a specific, position description. But I think what you're saying is absolutely right. It's that selection and orientation into one, and maybe that's a better way of framing it. I think my term inclusive volunteer selection doesn't capture all of the ways that our programs select/orient folks. So maybe a better process would be volunteer selection and onboarding or something like that. I'm open to other terminology, but thanks for raising that. Yeah, it does get into the intersection of selection and orientation. Does that answer your question, or you have anything you want to add there?
It does, and I just want to add that, as much as I I occupy myself at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to anticipate who will volunteer and what type of volunteers they will be. I always find that often people who have a lot of volunteer potential also volunteer with a lot of other organizations and don't end up being necessarily the most active volunteers, and people who I would have not really expected or anticipated to be good or active volunteers. So that's one of the things I'm always cautious about with I liked your description of selection, and you always have to be careful if you are denying people from the program based on their perceived volunteerism. And I always emphasize when I talk to new trainees and at info sessions that everybody's contribution, you know, some people work a full-time job and they have kids, and their small contribution is, you know, I mean, as long as they get their required hours, is just as valuable as someone who volunteers dozens of hours a month. And I really make that really clear from the beginning that some people volunteer by the time they graduate, right? They already have 100 hours or something. And then there's other people who barely squeak it in on June 30th, and they've had to do some online and some alternative volunteering. So I like your description of selection for positions within the organization, rather this thinking selection versus deny, because you just never know with volunteers, right? What will come of them, and they always surprise you.
Then I mean, yeah, thank you for that. In a couple, yeah, you generated a couple different ideas in my mind. You're absolutely right. A best practice, if we're going to deny a volunteer, for lack of a better term, we need to be able to describe specifically why that volunteer didn't meet our position description or isn't going to be successful in moving forward with the program. And if we're not able to do that, then we need to look again or reflect on or respect. Michael Villalobos, who's a trainer at the DEI office at UC Davis, says respect means literally to look again. We need to respect that process and really understand and respect that individual and look again and say, is there something that I missed, or am I making an assumption here? So you're right. It is a best practice to communicate why that individual is not going to be successful in moving forward, and invite them to return next year and to communicate that. And again, that's where, if we're changing our application materials based on the needs of the program every year, it does become a little bit clearer. Like, okay, we really enjoyed meeting you, and we're looking for some folks who have these specific skills for this year. And that's what organizations of all kinds do, volunteer organizations and organizations that are hiring staff. I do want to acknowledge quickly, we're going to go to a comment from Anne in the chat, and then to Dawn, who's got her hand up. And yes, so Anne raises, the problem I'm seeing is outreach, and that's really the identification piece. And I don't know that we're going to have a chance to get into that in a deep way during the Promising Practices Exchange discussion, because we are focusing on that selection process. Although, as Maggie mentioned, we're edging a little bit into the orientation piece. But yeah, I think outreach is a topic that I'd love to tackle down the line. And I think that Melissa Womack's expertise with social media and communication could be really valuable there. But the question I ask is, again, going back to that idea of organizational culture, if the organizational culture is such that we believe that the best volunteers are those that reflect our identity characteristics, we can take time. It might be useful to take time to try to shift the organizational culture so that we truly can become a space of inclusion and belonging for any volunteer that wants to be engaged with our program. So I think we can do work on outreach without having our focus be outward, if that makes sense, and really focus on creating the culture of belonging and inclusion, wherein diversity, equity, and inclusion are truly core values. But yeah, thank you for raising that. And I love the idea of focusing on that. And I think engaging Melissa's expertise with social media and communication would be super helpful. And there's a new coordinator at the statewide level in Oregon who also has a marketing and communications background. She's going to be doing a talk on this topic at the EMG conference, which goes from September 14th through September 17th. It's online. Something like $50. Missy's the chair of the national committee, so maybe she could speak a little bit more about that. But I think her expertise, she's going to present 6 findings that are limitations of Master Gardeners reaching more diverse audiences than we currently do. Dawn, I saw that you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to chime in, or did your comment get covered?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to chime in. I wanted to say this is such an important conversation that we're having about inclusive volunteer selection, and I am in the luxury of overseeing 2 counties that have plenty of applicants. We are in a position to be quite selective. So I want to acknowledge that actually in some ways is a privilege as well. But I also want to talk a little bit about the selection process. Inclusive volunteer selection process is only half of the equation. What kind of structural bias do you have in your program? Because you can bring in, or we can bring in people that are working, we can bring in younger people, but if all of our volunteer opportunities are Tuesday mornings from 10 to 12, then we can recruit for them, we can do a lot of outreach, we can have an inclusive selection process, but we need to have a place to have them be able to volunteer. And that's as equally as an important part of the whole piece. You can't have one without the other. And so I just wanted to put that out there as something to think about in terms of expanding our programs and our outreach and who we are.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And Lauren said the same thing when we were having a conversation about how to structure this conversation. And I was like, oh, it might be too much to start talking about that structural piece. And Lauren was like, I'm sorry, there's a noise in the background here, but Lauren was like, that is volunteer selection. That's passive volunteer selection. Whereas the conversation that we're having is about active volunteer selection. What choices are we making? And you know, the structural pieces are all choices, but sometimes they're a little bit dark to us. You know, we don't necessarily think, oh, I have agency to change this or that. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Dawn. It's like a strainer, you know. We're talking about, you know, folks that are being pushed through a structure, and we might only end up with folks who can accommodate the schedule that we create. So we have 2 more, I think 2 more comments in the chat, or 2 more hands raised. Let's go to Lauren, and then this might be our final comment, because we have 3 more minutes left, and I want to respect our time. And I'm also going to throw it over to Missy to just briefly chime in about that Extension Master Gardener Conference at the national level. So Lauren, can we go to you, and then we'll go to Missy?
Yeah, hopefully my comment kind of wraps everything up together. One of the things that I've noticed just from being a volunteer in my county and seeing and listening to everyone else in other counties, when you say you have 60 applicants and you can take 60, truly some places are limited because we only have room for 20 people in a room. So when we start talking about selection and things like that, I mean, even the room, the location where you're having it, parking, time of day. We live in a county, and I think Maggie can attest to this, when you have a county where there's a high mountain population and a low population, if it's a class that's in winter and people are driving down from the mountain, they aren't coming when it's dark. Like, it's a whole different thing. And I'm in a bi-county one, so we're 2 counties in one. For some reason, I don't know how this happens, people don't want to drive over the bridge to one side, which then also means people don't want to drive over the bridge to do outreach on the other side. So for us, we have all these little structural things that literally just by changing the location of the training could open it up to so many more people. And it truly is just a 5-mile drive, could change lots of things. And then part of that comes back to organizationally, do we have contracts for other space? Is there free space? Are there partners that we could partner with and get that space? So there's other things that come with selection that we say, if the training's going, if we give all the details for the training simply by stating it's going to be on the valley floor in the winter at 8, you know, and end at 8 p.m., you've already deselected people who aren't going to be driving at night or have bad vision. Like, it just is what it is. So even those tiny things that we do, you just have to think about a little bit and be like, we really don't have volunteers from this location or this area of our county. Why is that? Oh, we've never had a training over there. We've never had outreach over there. It's weird, but once you start looking at some of those things, you're like, oh yeah, that could possibly be it.
Thank you, Lauren. And I do want to acknowledge that I think, Maggie, you had your hand up again, and I think I missed you when I was looking at it during the other time. So okay, you're giving me the, no, don't pass it to me. All right, thank you, Lauren, for expanding on that. And then I do want to I do want to invite Missy to share a little bit about the Extension Master Gardener Conference online, and note that there's some good stuff in the chat. So Maggie's talking about having trainings online. Dawn's talking about her experience with changing locations. So there's a lot of knowledge in the room and a good opportunity to continue this conversation in September.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Marissa asked me to talk for just a sec about the Extension Master Gardener Coordinator Conference. This is hosted by the Extension Master Gardener National Committee. The mission of the National Committee is to serve coordinators, state and county coordinators, for the betterment and betterment of the program and empowerment of our volunteers nationwide. So this coordinator conference is hosted every other year. This year, of course, it's going to be virtual. We're going to be focusing in 3 topic areas: communication, evaluation, and professional development. The professional development piece is specifically geared around professional development for coordinators. You can get more information at the link that I posted in chat, and let me know if you have any questions. It's $50 registration this year, and yeah, I'm happy to answer questions about the sessions, what you might expect before you enroll if you're interested. I'm sorry, it sounds like I might have had a little bit of an audio issue. I apologize.
Thank you, Missy. Thanks for providing that insight. And I can say that I did have a chance to talk with Leanne from the Oregon Master Gardener program, and I just think that she's going to have a lot of really interesting and exciting content to share. Anne asks, the site says it's $230. Is there a discount? And I believe that, yeah, there's a fee that's just specific to the online and virtual.
Yeah, I think the 230 was for the live, but they're not doing live.
And Maggie is shouting out the Ag in the Classroom conference online this year, and it's free. So that's awesome. That might be a good CT post, because yeah, certainly these online opportunities are creating, yeah, or the movement to online is creating opportunity for us to access some conferences and information and discussions that might otherwise be a little challenging to access. So with that, I'm going to close us up for today. I hope that you will communicate with me via email if you have any questions or suggestions or ideas. I hope you'll register for the Promising Practices Exchange event on the 28th of September. And I'll leave this room open in case coordinators want to connect with one another. And I'm wishing all of you well throughout the state of California, and just stay safe out there.